Does your workforce understand the what and why behind the way you pay? And I think the future benchmark of can you have that conversation over a cup of coffee is one that compensation and HR professionals should really hold themselves to.
I love that. So you're definitely, leaning into where we're going in the future. So it's a sign of a good brand when you know it's got longevity and it can pivot to the changing environment. Are you ready to dive into the dynamic world of compensation management? Join us on a journey where we unravel the latest trends, tackle your burning questions, and explore innovative strategies that are shaping the future of compensation, all with a cup of coffee in hand. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Comp and Coffee. And today is a little special because today is our 100th episode. So we're in celebration mode today here, and we're going to be a little self-indulgent and do a little bit of reflection. Brief bit of history. The podcast began back in January 2018. Kudos to you if you've been following us since then. That was under the Pay Factors brand, which was then obviously acquired by Payscale in 2021. We loved the podcast. We knew you loved the podcast. So we've carried on with the podcast. It's had a few different people who have been running it. I've been doing it now for probably about 8 months, maybe more, I think. But we really wanted to just spend some time today celebrating our birthday episode. And I brought a couple of special guests along with me for this special episode. I have Heather Kruger, who's Senior Director of Corporate Marketing. So Heather is my content queen and my content creating friend. We have huge amounts of fun here at Payscale and thinking about all the wonderful ideas for podcasts, for research, for conference, for all the kind of amazing content that we create here and generally just debating what's going on in the world of work. So very pleased to have you here, Heather. And I'm also joined by Zach Jamieson, who's Manager of HR here at Payscale. So Zach, until recently, was my HR business partner. So he is my oratory on all things HR. So I wanted to get him along to come and talk about some of these topics here today. So welcome, Heather, and welcome, Zach. Do you want to both say hi, introduce yourselves to the audience? Heather, do you want to start first?
Yeah, happy to. So thank you for having me, Ruth. I think this is my second time on Comp and Coffee. It's been a while since my last one. I am happy to be here. As Ruth knows, I love talking about the world of HR. I'm a marketer by trade, but my passion and interest is truly the world and future of work. So happy to be here. Zach?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Thanks, Ruth, for having me. As Ruth shared, I am the HR manager at Payscale. I lead a team of HR business partners, most recently been supporting our marketing and revenue employees, but now supporting our product engineer and G&A teams. Like Heather and Ruth, I've been in HR for quite some time and really enjoy talking about it. So thank you for having me.
Well, great to have you both here. So before we do some reflecting, I thought I'd just quickly lean into the name of the podcast because we quite often get asked about why is it called Comp and Coffee. It's a funny story actually because Comp and Coffee was the name that Pay Factors, launched the podcast under. At that time that happened back in 2018, I was still working for Curo, the company that I co-founded. We were partners with Pay Factors. We did a lot of thought leadership with them. And I had been running a breakfast session called Coffee and Comp for about 3 years prior to this. So we had a little, fight about the name, the brand, where did it come from? But I love Comp and Coffee. So, we'll stick with that name. And why do we call it Comp and Coffee? Well, I think the original intention has carried on. The aim was really to create an environment where we could have conversations about compensation as if you were basically having a cup of coffee with your comp pals. Quite often, depending on the size of your organization, you may be just a band of one person in your organization. And so we wanted to provide a forum where we could talk about the topics you wanted to talk about. You could feel like you were having a cup of coffee with friends and talking about the problems of today, breaking news and all those kinds of things. So I also like to quite think about what our audience is doing when they're listening to the podcast. So maybe I think they're listening to it as they make a cup of coffee in the morning, walking their dog in the morning. I know I quite often listen to podcasts when I'm walking, where I listen to most of my podcasts is on a plane. I spend quite a bit of time on a plane going backwards and forwards across the pond. So Heather, I know you're a fan of the Comp and Coffee brand. Tell us why you're a fan. And we also lent into that quite heavily at World at Work Total Rewards Conference this year. So, give me your thoughts there.
Yeah, definitely. So this is where the marketer comes out. So Comp and Coffee, it's so catchy. But the reason why I think it has even developed more merit than it originally started with is where we are today as employers and workforces, and where we're moving towards with changing dialogue around pay. Comp and Coffee started off as a podcast and environment for compensation professionals to learn more about compensation, have that virtual cup of coffee with one another. And we want to nurture those spaces. So at World at Work this year, we actually, we made our space, we made our booth a pseudo coffee house. And we wanted to bring people in and we wanted to have, that conversation about comp over a cup of coffee. But where I see our field and our practice going in compensation is the mark of great compensation is going to be in the future. Can you have this conversation with an employee over a cup of coffee? Have we as employers and workers become so educated, mature, and familiarized with the practice of compensation that we can have that? This is the reality of work. We are all here to be paid, to do work we enjoy in the best of cases. And we want to have those conversations simply and easily over a cup of coffee. So I think that's a really good aspirational vision for the Comp and Coffee brand too. At World at Work, we had a slogan on our booth, does your workforce understand the what and why behind the way you pay? And I think the future benchmark of can you have that conversation over a cup of coffee is one that compensation and HR professionals should really hold themselves to.
I love that. So you're definitely, leaning into the, where we're going in the future. So it's a sign of a good brand when it's got longevity and it can pivot to the changing environment. So Zach, are you a podcast fan?
I am.
Which are your
Yeah,
favorites? Where do you listen to podcasts?
I do enjoy podcasts, Ruth, and I, like you, enjoy them while I'm walking or running on my treadmill. If I'm doing some quiet work, I might throw a podcast on and listen while I'm working. Some of my favorites are, I Hate It Here, People Managing People, People Problems. So you can see just a varying different mix of HR podcasts that I enjoy listening to.
Oh, great. Well, I know a couple of those. I'll have to go and look at some of the others. I Hate It Here is Heather Yusuf's podcast. Yes. Right. So Heather Yusuf, we're going to talk about conference later on today. Heather, I'm going to be on a panel with Heather at a conference. So thanks for that call out, Zach. Okay, so time for a little reflection. Let's be self-indulgent. I think at the grand old age of 100, we can do that. So we're going to take 3 episodes that Liz Sheffield, my podcast partner in crime, our content manager, has selected for us. We're going to quickly reflect on what was covered in those episodes, and then we're going to think about what's changed in the world since then. So the first one that Liz picked for us was episode 25 that was broadcast back in May 2019. And in this episode, we were joined by Kim Taylor, who's still here at Payscale. Kim and I regularly do podcasts and webinars together. She is our VP of Compensation Services and Consulting. So Kim came on as the expert guest and they talked about salary structures, and she covered the basics of what they were and how to put them in place. And at that time was really talking about the importance of maturing your pay practices to create pay structures, and about how as an organization, once you get to a particular size, you need to start thinking beyond the employee and the price for the employee to thinking about the relativity of jobs and employees within them. So kind of moving away potentially from job-based pricing to market pricing to pay grade or level-based pricing. And that was probably pretty prescient, because if you think about that, May 2019 was actually when the first state-based pay transparency legislation was passed. Colorado was passed in May 2019, didn't come into effect till 2021 in Colorado. But since then, we have seen a huge push by organizations to mature their compensation practices so that they can comply with the legislation in terms of posting pay ranges. But not only that, thinking about the impact on existing employees. So, big movement happening since that podcast was broadcasted. So, Zach, I'm interested to hear from you how you think things have evolved in terms of adoption of salary structures, especially the journey we've been on here at Payscale.
Yeah, this has been a unique one for us specifically. We had an office in Denver. We weren't a full remote organization when that legislation was passed. And so we saw the real time impacts as an organization and decided that even though not all states were abiding by legislation or having to abide by legislation, we were going to go ahead and post our ranges. So we kind of pushed forward with our transparency for our employees and set that expectation, hopefully, for others to do the same and kind of meet us where we're at. Next for us, as far as a leveling perspective, we're currently working with leaders to identify the correct leveling and titling for their teams. Our next steps in that process are to roll out this framework company-wide and work with our employees and managers on how to speak to those career paths, how to have that career conversation in one-on-ones on a regular basis. So that's kind of our next steps in our transparency.
So we're going on our own maturity journey, definitely, in terms of salary structures, which is what we're seeing in our customers and reflected in our research, our compensation best practice research. One of the key trends that we saw, we've been trying to look at, how can we see practitioners responding to the legislation? And it's definitely the push to deploy more salary structures, simplify salary structures, focus on job architecture, even things like addressing job descriptions. So, Heather, you went back to listen to that episode. What were your takeaways from that?
Well, not only listening to the episode, but, to the point that you made around Colorado legislation and legislation being a root of a lot of the evolution of compensation that we're seeing today. When you think about, take that big step back and go, okay, but why legislation? Why are we at this point now? What lawmakers and leaders are looking to solve is gender and racial pay disparity based on non-compensable factors. And so, to your point, Ruth, Kim offering this very prescient perspective, the reason for pay transparency legislation is to equal the playing field to some extent for workers, to give workers traditionally disadvantaged or held back by salary history disclosure, more of an opportunity to increase their wages as they move from job to job. One of the points that was raised in episode 25 was this astute insight. This isn't a department level thing. It's about creating levels within the organization. Now, there's some exceptions to that, which they acknowledge. Sometimes you pay higher for higher paying or faster moving roles. They used an example of tech companies, and I think you could extend it to service-based companies. You tend to see structures broken out when the people in those functions are manifesting the product. For a tech company, software developer is going to have a higher pay premium, maybe a higher structure. For a professional services business, you're going to see that with consultants. So it's not about structures creating this monolithic view of how you pay, but it's about having a sound and rational and systematic approach so that we can fulfill the root intent of this changing legislation to help close those gender and racial pay gaps. I thought it was funny, when the podcast took what I could only describe as a wild turn, talking about, markets of one or structures of one. And I've been at Payscale long enough that I just was like, oh, no. This is not how you do it.
Yeah.
Well, but yeah.
It's not that long ago, it's 5 years ago. And normally change doesn't happen in compensation that quickly, but we've just seen, a fundamental shift in thinking. And as you say, Heather, it's centered around this premise of how do we ensure we're able to make that comparison of comparable work, equitable work, however, whichever jurisdiction you're focusing in that you want to do. And that's really, what's driving this change that we've seen since that episode 25.
Yeah. One of the examples that the podcast guests in episode 25 were referencing as well was this notion of maybe you see a pay difference between front-end dev and back-end dev based on the skills. But for whatever reason, that brought to mind the equity lawsuits that we've seen around warehouse versus retail. And when you think about front-end dev versus back-end dev, there's this interesting correlation to be made about warehouse versus retail.
Yeah.
When the jobs are fundamentally similar, yes, they require different skills in some ways. A warehouse worker is going to be lifting heavier things than a retail worker, as an example. But more than that, you see a gender divide in those roles. And, that reality, how are we breaking that down and making the practice, to your point, Ruth, move forward in a faster and more meaningful way for the practice?
Yeah. And, that's obviously what we're all about in terms of advancing here at Payscale. We see that as part of our responsibility in helping employers tackle that problem. And I know, Zach, from the experience here at Payscale, the leveling is fundamental to our DEIB strategy as well, in terms of being able to give, you mentioned it, like career frameworks, being able to equip managers to have progression conversations so that, we can make sure that we're applying consistent decisions around progression in the organization. I know that's something you're quite hot on at the moment.
I think clear expectations to everyone understands what is the responsibility of each role, what I need to do to be in that role, maybe where the gaps are that I have today, and then speaking with your manager, like how do I get to that next level? So transparency is key to all of that, and really moving the needle there.
Yeah. So our next episode was episode 50. And this went out in May 2020. Can we all remember what we were doing in May 2020? Yeah, we were in pandemic times. And the episode talked about, just as everyone was adjusting to the new normal of working from home, the country was starting to reopen and businesses were focusing on how to bring people back to the office post the COVID-19 shutdowns. And so in this episode, it was Matt, Bill, and Russ, and they talked about approaches and challenges organizations are working through to safely and efficiently open offices while meeting the evolving expectations and concerns of talent. So 4 years on, where are we at? Well, for those of you who thought everything would return to as it was before, we have not all gone back to the office. And remote work is still very much with us and is really reshaping our labour markets. We've seen organisations trying to encourage employees back to work with mixed success. And we've seen RTO mandates that have really done some damage in terms of talent retention in organisations. So Heather, you said you're a keen observer of like what's happening in the world of work. What's your take on where we are now?
I was thinking about this and reflecting on it, and May 2020 really struck me because I was like 4 years ago. And that number almost feels wrong because it feels like way more than 4 years, but only been a little bit more than 4 years ago. At this point, it's a little bit contrived to say like cat's out of the bag and many workers can work from home, but it's true. We have shown that many workers are able to work from home. We can effectively and consistently deliver our performance. And, there's the occasional travel needed sometime. I think my boldest, hottest perspective on RTO, particularly RTO mandate, is who is delivering the we have to go back message. And full disclaimer, I'm about to say some like classic gatekeeping statements right now, but like if you are a worker or a business leader in a position that might be defined as a more traditional household with only one working partner, and maybe you don't have any caregiving responsibilities, whether children or elders, like I don't think you should get to make a call on RTO. Because such a fundamental aspect of our functioning society is our need to care for others and be present in our families and in our lives. And this monolithic return to office, go back to the way it was, when part of the merit of what we experienced through the pandemic is the way it wasn't working for the majority of people. Mental health wasn't in a good place. Granted, mental health got worse during the pandemic. But we're climbing out of an era of presence as proof that you're working into one of demonstrated impact. You don't have to be physically in a chair at work to show that anymore. And as workers, we all know that. We all feel that. So yeah, that's my really bold take on RTO. And one of the reasons why I work at Payscale, because we are not doing it.
We are fully RTO. And it's interesting because you talked about, I mean, my guess is that CEOs of organizations saying people have got to be back to work. They're not productive unless they're in the office. I always love a Paul Wolf quote. Paul Wolf's on our board here at Payscale. He's also a HR thought leader. He said, your culture isn't built by the walls of your office, which I love that quote. But I also think about different perspectives of different groups of employees here, because I have a daughter who has just started work at a professional services firm here in London, and she's really struggling because she kind of needs to be in an office where she's being mentored. So she's in that group that we talk about, the young generation starting out. And I do worry that they will have a slower ramp because they're not necessarily getting, everybody in the office around them that potentially we all had when we started our careers. But you alluded to it, Heather. This has been our experience at Payscale. We've been remote, Zach, since the 1st of January 23, I keep saying, or was it 22? 23.
Technically, we were remote before that, but we went fully remote at that point. We did have some, yes, we did have some office locations, and a few people would go in occasionally. But yeah, we're coming up on a few years into our remote first, guidance, and I think our employees love it. They love the flexibility. They love the ability to work kind of from wherever they'd like. There are some boundaries that we put in place, and they do have to notify us if they're working out of the country. But for the most part, they're able to work from where they're most comfortable. And I think that's really important. And we see that show up in the work that they bring to us at Payscale. And it's really great. I do think that there is a little bit of missed connection that we constantly have to be monitoring. So that could be a good and a bad thing. We at Payscale have an executive team that very much supports us getting in person, getting together, collaborating, building that connection, so that when we do come back home to our remote environments, we're able to still collaborate with one another. We're still able to work and get things done like we need to. So I think that those in-person events, maybe they're not all the time, maybe it's once a year, twice a year, those are still really important. And to Heather's point, it does require some travel from our employees, but I think that time is really beneficial for the success of the organization.
And presumably you've had to rethink some of the talent lifecycle processes to make them adapt to the remote environment, like onboarding, for example, I'm thinking of.
Yes. Yeah. To your point earlier, our employees that are coming to us newer in their careers are having a more difficult time ramping, as you discussed. You can't necessarily look to your left or your right and ask a question of your coworker or even your manager in real time. You might have to Slack them. You might have to wait for a response. And sometimes that's difficult to do, especially when you're newer in your career. That could derail you from working on a project or anything that you have to accomplish.
And also managers have to learn to adapt to this new environment as well. It's much harder managing someone remotely than when you kind of see them in the office. I mean, you manage a relatively, good sized team, Heather. How have you had to adapt?
Well, I think it goes back to your point around mentorship and learning as well. People managers and HR teams, like the way that we're focused on coaching and mentoring and learning has really fundamentally shifted. When we were all in the office together, I wasn't in the office at Payscale, but I think about my last role, you could almost osmote the learning. You're sitting next to each other and there's folks on your team who are like listening to the way you deliver a presentation, or, hey, I'm going to take this client call, they don't need to know you're there. Just like pop in and listen and like learn that way. That sort of stuff is much harder now. And so being deliberate about the learning experiences, I think, is critical. But in some ways, it's also like made me a better manager, if that's a funny thing to say. Like, I can't just swoop by and be like, hey, what are you doing? And like distract them from their flow state. It's like, it really does provide the opportunity to nurture productivity. Also, I sound like a terrible manager right now. Saying that I did that before. I didn't do that before either. But like in those moments where you think like, oh, what's happening with this? And it's like, you pause and you reflect. You're like, oh, do I need to know that right now? Or can I send an email with, hey, just like get this information to me like at your convenience or by this time? Like it makes us better at nurturing and supporting the productivity of those around us while still also having those connection and collaboration points.
Yeah. So a lot of change. I think we'll continue to see change, and I think we'll continue to see, us adapting to those remote environments. So the last episode we're going to reflect on today is episode 75, which was broadcast October 22. So I had joined the podcast by this stage. So this was myself, Bill, and Russ. And at that time, we discussed the new phenomenon of quiet quitting. We talked about what it was. Was it work to rule? Was it engagement problems? And how HR and compensation professionals should respond. So a reminder, if you can't remember it, quiet quitting, was based around the concept that you are still performing your duties, but you're no longer subscribing to the hustle culture mentality that work has to be your life. And there was a lot of debate at the time about, was it real? Was that what it was really about? We broke some of that down in the podcast, and really kind of questioned whether it was really a question of work-life balance or a broader question, which I thought it was, around the decline in employee engagement that we were seeing in the workplace. So, Heather, I can see you getting fired up for this one. You go for it first. Tell us your thoughts on this one.
There are so many things to say about this. I'm going to see if I can collect my thoughts. First and foremost, Ruth, when I was re-listening to the podcast, I love that you reminded everyone of the definition of it. That idea of you're still performing your duties, but no longer subscribing to hustle culture. This was touched on in the episode, but when you just talk about quiet quitting in terms of the headline, that definition is lost. There is some merit to this notion of doing your job and doing it well, but not grinding. And I think the employee engagement conversation is an interesting one to dig into here. There's some old research. I think it's old research at this point. I heard it at HR Tech, maybe 2016, 2017, from Dr. Moon, who's now at Columbia University. And what her research showed was that when you look at measures of employee engagement and workaholism, you couldn't actually distinguish the two. And that, this is almost 10 years ago at this point, that has stuck with me. And at least once a year, I think about that research, because today, when you think about employee engagement, like we as businesses, we have ourselves wrapped around this idea of employee engagement because it yields to things like productivity and business performance. But I always pause and ask the question, like, is it employee engagement that we're seeking, or is it grind culture that we're seeking? Is it the hours so that we can hit our performance metrics and our business metrics? Because if you can't tell the difference in the data, how do you know which one you want? And what are those distinguishing features of genuine employee engagement that make people want to invest more than their duties in the success of themselves and their role in their career in the business? So yeah, Zach, what's your point of view on employee engagement versus workaholism?
I think creating boundaries is super important here, right? Like understanding when enough is enough, when an employee needs to unplug, go recharge. We want them to come back tomorrow. And so it's really about knowing when enough is enough and when you're maybe pushing your employee just a little bit too much. And I think those signs are going to present themselves, right? Maybe it's rushed work, maybe it's you're sensing an attitude, or you're hearing rushed responses. There are different social cues that you can look at and see when an employee might be upset or might be being pushed a little bit too far. And so I think creating those healthy boundaries and revisiting those boundaries on a regular basis and ensuring that you're both holding each other accountable to that, employee and manager.
Did you? What was your take on quiet quitting at the time, Zach? And was it something you felt we were experiencing here at Payscale?
I do think we were experiencing it. We were hearing about it in, some of our exit interviews, maybe not from the person that was leaving, but maybe they were exiting and they noticed it of their coworkers. And so it was really about doing stay interviews, re-engaging managers with employees, especially in a remote environment where you can't just turn to your left or your right and check in on that person. You have to be a little bit more intentional about that Slack message or setting up that Zoom call at the right time. And so it's really knowing about, checking in and ensuring that you're listening and watching.
And I think it was representative of the time of the tension that was in the workplace. And I don't think we're done with that tension yet. The tension between power to the employee, power to the employer. I've seen a lot of people jump in and claim with, softening labour markets, wage rates potentially coming down. Yay, the employer has power back again. Well, I'm not there. I think there's a lot more tension to play out, and we really need to think about how we radically move cultures on and shift the culture to a place where the employee has choices, about where they work, when they work, how they work, whilst at the same time ensuring, that we achieve productivity as a business. And I think that tension is still really real in a lot of businesses today. I don't know any closing thoughts there, you two, on that?
For this, to me, is the root and the interesting part of all of these conversations is when you think about pandemic-driven layoffs at the start of the pandemic. And then you think about, just like the crisis of consciousness that we all experienced going through the pandemic. And, in the episode where Bill and Matt and Russ were talking about predictions for what's ahead in the May 2020 episode, no one predicted the Great Resignation. But the Great Resignation was really a reflection of how workers felt they were treated during the pandemic. And then you come out of it and it's this back and forth and pendulum. And the thing that's interesting to me is there's meaning in all of these jests. When we say these headline statements like quiet quitting, Bill referencing your wage, it's not these statements are not about an anti-employer sentiment, but it is, I think, about calling attention to what is today like the operating principle nurtures an adversarial dynamic. We have not fully moved away from these notions of human as capital. When we apply these capital principles, and this is not like an anti-capitalist perspective, but when you apply capital principles to people, you are going to get capital dynamics. And capital dynamics are push and pull, supply, demand. They are inherently adversarial because they represent the binary movement of a system of up and down. And if we want to get to a better way, to your point, Ruth, we need to think about what are workers within organizations and how do we nurture dynamics that foster things like choice and partnership and well-being. And we're not quite there yet. It's not to say we can't get there on the economic operating model that we have, but we're not there yet.
So it's quite an exciting time, Zach, to be an HR practitioner, because we're seeing such transformation in the workplace. Is that what you're feeling, or are you just feeling super stressed about all the work that needs to be done?
All of the above. No, I think it's a fun time. I think as HR professionals, we're going to continue to be pressed for transparency. And I think we've talked a lot today about pay transparency, but I think it's going to extend even beyond that. I think people are going to want to constantly know more maybe why we're making business decisions, why we're bringing in headcount. And so I think as HR professionals, as leaders, we're going to continue to have to figure out what is the right amount of information to be sharing and what is the right time to share that information.
Great. Well, thank you both for doing that little bit of reflection on me and helping us to celebrate this, our 100th episode. But the celebrations aren't over. We've got more celebrations to come. We are about a week and a half away from conference, which is Payscale's annual virtual conference. Heather, you're in charge of making that show get on the road. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how our audience can engage?
Yes, definitely. So conference, as the title indicates, is all about comp. And I really do think that's the most exciting thing about this event. It offers keen and practical insights to compensation professionals or those responsible for comp, not as broad as rewards, not as broad as HR practices, but really dedicated and focused on comp. It has the added benefit of you will never be able to say the word conference correctly ever again if you attend conference. I can prove this because my husband does not work at Payscale and always says it conference now, even when he's talking about his education-focused conferences. But the teams at Payscale have dedicated themselves to bring really impressive practitioner voices to bear in this year's event. I am, as you noted earlier, Ruth, the session that you're moderating with Heba, Sarika, and Jessica on day one, our keynote. I'm so excited about that one because it's all about the urgency of compensation practices in modern HR. How do we get back to those basic, fundamental, foundational building blocks that make things like engagement and culture possible, and why comp is going to be a key variable in that formula for success? There's a few others that I'm excited about. Choosing the right salary data to ensure fair and competitive pay on day one. And the thing to call out as well is that the main event, all of this education and all of these sessions, it's free to attend. Like we at Payscale, we're just jazzed about comp. So we like doing conference for free. But we also offer like deeper dive educational workshops at the end of each day. And that's to give folks leading compensation and HR teams a little bit of a fast ramp on key practices. So one of the workshops that we have is best practices for equitable pay structures. We're going to cover pay ranges, internal and external equity, foundations for leveling. You know, if you're getting started on your compensation journey and you want to do so in a way that has an eye towards equity in the future, that's a great workshop because it's small group, it's practical, and it's low cost, all things considered. Developing a pay comms strategy is another workshop on the third day that's also top of mind. As you're navigating these new practices, I should have muted my computer. Sorry, everybody. You want to make sure that you have equally internal communication set up. And then, of course, reporting. So for teams that want to dig deep on market pay and pay factors reporting, we've got workshops for that. So go to payscale.com/conference. Never say the word correctly again. And enjoy the event.
So you can go there. We will include the link in the episode notes. If you follow us on LinkedIn, it's all across our LinkedIn. I've been posting this week about the sessions that I'm involved in. So I've been including the link there. So you can follow me, Ruth Thomas, on LinkedIn. Thank you both for giving your time today. And audience, hope you enjoyed the celebratory episode. Let us know what you think at coffee@payscale.com. And if there's a topic that in a past episode that you enjoyed that you'd like us to revisit, let us know and make sure you register for conference. Thank you very much.